And my presentation is on widgets on iOS. Apple introduced widgets as part of iOS 12 first, and then on iOS 14 it added home screen support, and now our current version iOS 16 added lock screen support. Widgets can be easily made using WidgetKit. So using WidgetKit and Widget API with Swift UI, we're able to make apps for iOS, app widgets for iOS, iPadOS, macOS, and even watchOS. There are four main different types of widgets. The first one is the lock screen widget. Then we have the home screen widget. We also have a special kind called the Smart Stack, where it's just a stack of widgets, and we can show different ones depending on the time of day and other conditions. And then we have the watch complication. There are 5 different core concepts that we can look at for creating widgets. We'll want to know about timeline, entry, snapshot, placeholder, and reload policy. And we'll look at these in more detail. For timeline, this is basically the policy that we use to specify when to show the widget. Widgets typically you want to update them in a matter of minutes and hours and not seconds. That's because having the widget on the foreground and having frequent updates in seconds, that could drain the battery very fast. That's why newer versions of iOS has a budget set for widget updates. So there's restrictions to how many updates you can make in a certain time to preserve the battery. We have timeline entry. We can also call these entries. This is basically just an entry of date-time object and when to show the widget. So timeline is an array of entries, and entry is just a specification of when at the date time to show the widget. Snapshot is a timeline entry that represents the current state of the widget, and then placeholder is represents the loading state of the widget. We can make widgets call. We can do API calls over the network to load widgets, and sometimes that takes a lot of time to load the content. So it's a good idea to have a good placeholder put in place for those ones. And then most importantly, we can look at the reload policy, which we have 3 choices. The first one is at end. This is when we want to set the widget to update whenever the current timeline finishes. So for apps like calendar, reminders, and photos, we can update widgets on a scheduled basis, and nothing is very unpredictable. There's always future content to show, and we can just, for example, update it every hour and we won't really have any issues. And so at end is great for those apps. The next one, after, which takes in a date time object in the parameter. This is the most flexible kind that we can use. So these are great for apps like weather and stocks, where data is constantly changing, and at any given time we might need to update the widget. So this is the most flexible one. And then we have never. This one only updates the widget on a need basis. So for apps like notes and music, where the content of the app doesn't really change until the user interacts with it, the never policy is a great option. And it's also the most battery friendly. To make a great widget, there's some tips to follow. The first one is to make it personal. We can give the user information that they actually care about. And secondly, we want to make it informational. We want to collect data on our apps and see which part of the app is most frequently used by users and make that into a widget. And finally, we want to make the widget contextual. This means that on a small widget real estate, we can show different information depending on what the current context is. So if it's a sunny day, we might want to show a UV UV ray level as part of the widget. But on the same space, if it's raining, we might want to show like a precipitation data and so on. So we want to be flexible about what to show and when to show it depending on the context. We'll just do a quick demo to show you how widgets are made on iOS. To create a new widget, we'll first create a new project as an iOS app. Then we'll click on File, New, Target, and then search for Widget. You'll see the widget extension option. Click on Next, name the widget, and then click Finish. I already created an example widget called Birthday Widget for this project, and the folder for that is located right underneath the folder where all the app files are located in. So it's just right underneath that here. And if you go to the birthdayWidget.swid file, this is where most of the action happens for this widget. So we'll see things like the placeholder and get snapshot, like we saw in the slides. And here, the function getTimeline is the most important one to look at. So a timeline is an array of entry, and entry is what specifies when to show the widget. In this case, there's a loop here creating 5 entries, which is basically an entry that's separated by every hour. And so this entry is going to be every hour, 5 times, and that's the timeline that it'll run. And if you look at this line, the timeline is specified with the policy @end. So in this case, after these 5 time entries are used, it'll just refresh and create a new 5 entries for the timeline. To look at the view of the widget, you'll want to go to the birthday widget entry view, where we can control what's inside the widget. So this is where I specified what text to show and what information to show. In this case, I created a quick function to calculate how many days are left until my next birthday. And yeah, that's a pretty simple example. So basically, this is where you look at the view, and this is where you control the timeline. And that's the basics of widgets. That is all for this presentation. Thank you for listening, and here are the sources that I used to make this presentation. Thank you.